Okay, I have a bunch of people.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole LeBoeuf, the Assistant Administrator of NOAA's National Ocean Service and U.S. Representative to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. Thank you so much for joining us today at CHOW and for keeping up the conversation about ocean leadership. I'm so excited to be moderating today's panel. The theme of this panel is Ocean Climate Leadership on the World Stage, Prioritizing Ocean Observation, Science, and Climate Action to Maximize Global Impact. Before we begin, I'd like to just explain, at least for me, what ocean climate means. It means the work we do at the intersection of the ocean and climate change to both understand and predict how the ocean is expressing and how it might be used to mitigate climate impacts. In our race to get ahead of the climate curve, the United States' contribution to climate resilience and observations is extensive. We know more must be done, but the United States can't do it all. Today's panelists are on the front lines of making difficult choices about how and where the United States should sustain, improve, or even expand ocean and coastal science. This includes trying to figure out how and where communities, industry, and society need it most. From very different vantage points, our panelists advocate for how and where they believe U.S. contributions in ocean climate work will have the most impact so that we can contribute and build upon previous actions and trusted relationships around the world. Wearing both my NOS and my IOC hats, I can't help but see opportunities to work across organizations and with partners around the world to leverage what the United States is doing to detect changes in the ocean and with others around the world. Some of the IOC, for example's flagship activities include capacity development, ocean observations and services, ocean science, tsunami warning, and ocean literacy. The work of the IOC also includes coordinating activities associated with the UN Decade for Ocean Science, an international effort highlighting the importance of forming and sustaining partnerships and for working internationally to set priorities for our climate work. I will also note that how part of the way we prioritize ocean climate action in the United States is by lifting up voices that have been so far left out of the conversation about ocean and climate change. This includes bringing together in conversation and in priority setting a variety of decision makers. And like those on today's panel, that includes government, philanthropy, academia, and youth voices. It is only, in my view, when we add these important voices together that we can ensure the United States is contributing towards the best possible outcome for global ocean and coasts. To help us begin to highlight and identify ongoing and new areas for the United States to contribute, we have with us today a group of inspiring panelists who are each leaders in their own fields. And these are folks who have to make tough choices about prioritizing ocean observations, science, and climate action to maximize international reach. I'm honored today to be joined by Armin Alex, Pat Halpin, Charlotte Hudson, and Sue Biniaz. Together, they represent a diversity of backgrounds showcased in their unique perspectives for our conversation. So let's get started. With the breadth of work that this group does, can each of you please speak a bit on what ocean climate leadership looks like in the international arena of your area of expertise? And I'd like to begin with Armin. Armin is a member of Heirs to Our Ocean, a nonprofit empowering the next generation of leaders by connecting them in purpose, educating them on the intersection of environmental and humanitarian crises, and cultivating essential skills to create innovative solutions and real-world change. I will also note that as a youth leader, Armin is also the co-chair of the UN U.S. Youth Advisory Committee on the UN Decade for Ocean Science and is a distinguished environmental science communicator and ocean policy steward. With that, Armin, please, if you can even remember the question, please, let's hear your response.
Oh, I so greatly appreciate the warm welcome and so excited to see a full virtual room of amazing ocean stewards. Thanks for joining us, you all. Howdy, folks. My name is Armand Alex. I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas. That is the shoreline of Texas. It's the lands of the Karankawa, the Lipan Apache, and Coelatecan as well. And I'm so honored to be here. This is, I think, a wonderful question because it really does allow for us to provide from our perspectives what that might mean. And so ocean, climate leadership from my perspective as a Gulf South native in the U.S. and also representative of frontline community being right here on the coast, to me involves a deeply inclusive and intersectional approach. The Gulf South region, including my home of Corpus Christi, is uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We've heard all these things before: sea level rise, increased hurricane intensity, and I have the opportunity to sit on our city's Water, Shore, and Beach Advisory Committee as a scientist, and what we're really dealing with at the moment is extreme coastal erosion. But in terms of ocean climate leadership, for communities of color, these challenges are compounded by historical and environmental injustices and socioeconomic disparities as well. So this leadership means centering and listening with that comprehension piece as well, to the voices and experiences of marginalized communities in these decision-making processes. In my role as the co-chair of the United Nations U.S. Youth Advisory Committee for the UN Ocean Decade, I've seen firsthand how empowering youth, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds and communities, can lead to innovative solutions that really do inspire informative change as well. I want to stress that this ocean climate leadership really looks like prioritizing equity and justice in our ocean climate efforts, whether it's national, statewide, international, or local. And that ensures that our leadership not only mitigates climate impacts, but also critically uplifts and protects the communities most affected by these changes. Thanks, Nicole, for the question.
Thank you so much. And of course, you know this, you and I are from a very close proximity parts of the world. And I know from the beaches that I grew up on, how fast the coastline of Texas is eroding. So thank you for raising that as such an important issue that you're probably seeing on a daily basis. Next, Dr. Halpin, Professor Halpin leads the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University and sits on so many international scientific and conservation panels and program committees. Dr. Halpin, could you please speak a bit about what ocean climate leadership looks like in your arena?
Sure, thank you so much. So for me, I've been recently looking at the future of ocean climate leadership, really involving the rapid advance of ocean industrialization and climate change in the oceans. And this is a big topic that's been increasing quite a bit. And so that's where my focus has been recently these days. And it's bringing about a lot of what I call second generation environmental problems. So early on, 30, 40 years ago, we were focused quite a bit, we're still focused quite a bit on protecting habitats, protecting species. But now we're looking at the intersection and collision of multiple environmental goods kind of colliding with each other. So an example is a lot of our labs work these days is looking at things like offshore wind development, which is an environmental good. We need to decarbonize the coastal communities of the United States and Europe and elsewhere. But we're also now encountering how do we do that while still protecting highly migratory whales and seabirds and marine habitats. Another example is deep sea mining, where there's a stronger and growing need for minerals for developing batteries for electric vehicles and also decarbonizing our systems. But that's also a direct impact on critical deep sea habitats. So I'm seeing these kind of second generation wicked problems that are very different. I've been at this for decades, and this is kind of a new world now where we have environmental problem versus environmental problem. And so it's becoming more challenging to think about the leadership and how do you weigh these things together. My lab deals with making maps, and we really have this mantra that you cannot manage what you cannot map. And you need to be able to map out where the habitats, where the uses, things like that. And so we're very proactive, very applied science. And we find that it's a really great media to be able to actually sit down with stakeholders and to work through trying to find solutions. And so I'm always very much an optimist on how do you find solutions? How do you get countries and groups to work together? For international processes, my lab works one of the nodes for OPIS, the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, which is under IOC. So we mentioned IOC earlier. So CMAP is the node that's the World Data Center for marine mammals, seabirds, sea turtles, and sharks and rays of the world. So we have the big megafauna. I also am very involved, have been involved for quite a number of years with the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction process, especially on area-based management tool development and the science and data that are needed for that. Working with the Convention on Biological Diversity on describing ecologically or biologically significant areas around the world, which is something we've been working on for almost 2 decades now. And working recently with the International Seabed Authority on trying to develop regional environmental management plans for deep sea mining. And on a kind of a bilateral one, just to throw in something that's not an international one, I sit on the United Kingdom's EcoWind program, so I'm the only American non-UK advisor on their advisory board for wind energy for the UK. So there's huge active areas going on these days, and I think the things are, I'm an optimist. I think we're hitting new thresholds where we're finally seriously talking about decarbonizing our systems and things, but it's bringing about a new generation of leadership that has to fall in. And so I think it's a very interesting time. I could go on, but I will pass it along to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a rich answer. And you're absolutely right. We're in a new era of environmental problem versus environmental problem, or environmental solution versus environmental solution. And it seems increasingly complex, but as I find, that opens up a solution space as well in ways that we could not have fathomed before. Okay, so thank you. Next up, Charlotte Hudson. Charlotte directs the Lenfest Ocean Program, a grant-making program that identifies, supports, and communicates marine science concerning threats facing the world's ocean. Charlotte, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Nicole. And I'm glad to go third because I identify and pick up on many of the things Nicole, Pat, and Armin have already raised. And I think from the vantage point that I kind of encounter this space, I come from a philanthropic background. We do give grants, we give out money for ocean research. And as Nicole already mentioned, I also have the privilege of co-chairing the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And, you know, this is not the first US or not the first UN decade of ocean science, but it is the first UN decade for ocean science for sustainable development. And that last phrase is not by accident. And I think a lot of what we're discussing today is the realization now that what is happening in our oceans is also most pressing for people. And that is how we encounter the oceans, and that is our vantage point. And so when we're thinking about the climate space here, I will say, as you know, the UN board, our advisory board, met last 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we were all together. It's, you know, it's 13 members from 13 different countries. And the overwhelming discussion in the room is also very much about, this is not just about the oceans. The oceans is not distinct from what is happening in the climate. And if you are not in our space, if you are not thinking about the climate, you're not thinking about the future. And that's just, I think, the tagline for us is these things, while they are distinct areas of study, they may involve different biogeochemistry, different thinking and different expertise. What affects one affects the other. And if you're not thinking about how you are planning for ocean development, ocean restoration, ocean conservation, where you're placing marine protected areas, how you're restoring wetlands, if you're not thinking about how the climate may impact your area, then you're not going to be successful. And I will say, from a more philanthropic standpoint, I will say some of our grantees weren't super thrilled about this, but several years ago, we added what we call a climate question to our grant application. And not all of our projects have to do with climate change. You know, frankly, half of them do, half of them don't. We have 2 portfolio areas. But even the research projects that didn't have an explicit climate component as part of their research, they have to answer the question is, how have you considered the changing climate in your research plan? Because even if you are not thinking about climate as a research topic, if you're not thinking about what impacts that might occur in your area or to your species or to your planned project, then you're not looking forward. You know, I think most of marine science and a lot of the work we do in predicting forward is really looking backwards in order to look forwards. And I think the challenge now is we can no longer look backwards to predict what might happen in the future. We've got to use the best judgment, the best expertise, the best science we have to think about moving forward. And if you're not doing that in the ocean space, if climate isn't part of that conversation, then you're not looking forward.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very poignant. Well said. You know, I often talk about coastal infrastructure. And one of the things that I have just started repeating is that for the first time in the history of mankind, we are obliged to build infrastructure based upon conditions that we have not yet experienced. And that is so true across all of the things you were just discussing, conservation and restoration, right? The time series has taken on a whole new meaning when we start talking about climate and its impacts. So thank you so much. All right. Last but not least, Sue Biniaz, there's impossible to sum up your experience in a couple of sentences, but I will say that Sue has been the lead climate attorney for the United States for more than 25 years. She's worked on the front lines of so many negotiations for the environment, including law of the sea, East Asian affairs, Western Hemisphere affairs, human rights, refugees, law enforcement, so many things. Sue, thank you so much for being with us today. What does ocean climate mean to you?
Well, thanks, Nicole, and hello, everybody. Well, I came back in actually the first day of this new administration to work with Secretary Kerry on the bringing climate back to U.S. government priorities. And one facet of that has been a top priority of ours, and that is sort of the ocean climate nexus. So there are so many things to talk about. I could talk about it for a week, but I only have 2 minutes. So I'm just going to name 2 of the things that we have tried to focus on. Okay. The first thing is that we have tried to break down what we call the silos that have existed internationally. So the problem we've had is that a lot of the climate related fora, institutions, treaties, et cetera, have not been kind of adequately seized with the ocean aspect of their work and vice versa. So let me give you two examples of things we have tried to do. Within the UN FCCC and the Paris Agreement, we are a strong supporter of a group of parties called the Friends of the Ocean and Climate. And that's a group of countries that have tried to kind of highlight or raise the profile of the ocean climate linkage. And one thing that we have been able to do is to establish an annual dialogue. The next one will take place in a couple days in Bonn on the relationship between the two topics. So I think that's one thing. Now, on the opposite, the other side of the coin, in other words, an ocean forum that now takes into account climate is one of the things that Secretary Kerry did when he was Secretary of State, was start the Our Ocean Conference, as many of you probably know. In 2014, we just celebrated, basically 10 years of OOCs. The whole point of it was to draw international attention to threats facing the ocean, but one of the 6 kind of consistent themes of the Our Ocean Conference is climate change and the climate-ocean nexus. And in the last 3 years, we co-hosted the OOC with Palau, and then there was one in Panama, and just now in Athens. And we tried to make one of the top priorities the kind of ocean climate linkage. So those are 2 examples of kind of breaking down silos, which I think is really important internationally. Second, we're very focused on decarbonizing the international shipping sector. Now, some people would say, like, well, that's not really an ocean issue. It's not, but it is on the ocean and considered kind of ocean-based. And we're trying to align that sector with a safe global temperature trajectory, which we say is, keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. So a couple examples of that work. At COP27 a few years ago with Norway, we launched the Green Shipping Challenge, which encourages not just countries, not just sort of governments, but also ports, companies, NGOs, others, to make commitments that help kind of bend down the emissions curve from the sector. We now have over 40 green shipping corridors around the world, including several involving the United States. Last year, we bolstered that initiative by launching the Green Shipping Challenge Initiation Project, which is focused in particular on helping developing countries establish those kinds of corridors. And we're very active in the negotiations that are ongoing right now in the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, to implement the agreed goal of net zero emissions kind of close to 2050, around 2050. Last year, the IMO adopted a revised greenhouse gas strategy, as you may know, and this is kind of the implementation of that strategy. So those are 2 things. I could also talk about the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which the US is a party to. Sea level rise, we're very active on that issue. Early warning, contributing to the UN Secretary General's early warning for all initiative, et cetera, et cetera. We're also, as you sure many know, the United States is one of the 18 countries that's in the high level panel on the ocean. And, we try to contribute to that, not only in terms of ideas, but also in terms of sort of being a good role model as the United States. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sue. And yes, I think green shipping is on the ocean, but on behalf of the ocean that has pretty well maxed out its ability to store extra carbon, I would say it is very much an ocean issue. So thank you for your leadership on that. Okay, so for the next couple of questions, we can keep it organic. Folks not everybody has to answer, but would welcome anyone to just jump on in. So this is one of those quintessential questions I have to ask. What do you see as a top challenge for those working to either detect or to mitigate climate change impacts on our ocean? And where do you think the United States should prioritize additional investment? All right, I'm going to use the word investment, and I'm going to ask Charlotte to kick it off.
Funny, everybody always looks at me when it has to do with money. So yes, so I think, Nicole, that's an excellent question, and I'm going to answer this in two parts. I think for me, the greatest challenge that I foresee, that I see now and I foresee, is you know, as I said, we should look forward. You know, we should look at what's going to happen in the future. But yet, these are situations we haven't. These are habitats. These are environmental conditions. These are changing species distributions that we haven't encountered. And I think the unpredictability. It's both, and these are tied together. I think the unpredictability is by far the biggest challenge. We are being asked to make decisions about conditions and about environments we have yet to understand and yet to know what will happen. And so there is, of course, now a groundswell of research trying to make those predictions, right? And I think the work of many people, you know, both in NOAA and around the world, are trying to look at how do we predict and then make the best, use the best available science to think, you know, to think about how we should manage looking forward. So I think those investments, as much as I don't want to say this, there is a great need, and I think the US leads the way in ocean observations. Certainly in terms of data collection, that is a clear need to continue. It's not the most popular. It's both the most popular thing to say because everybody seems to get around it, but it's also not a popular thing to say because it doesn't seem like the most active, action-oriented activity either. So I will pair that by saying is then deciding what we need to understand and what we need to collect based on listening to the communities and listening to the users of that information to understand what information do we need to make better decisions. And I think that gets to Armand's point about like, what are coastal communities facing? What questions are they asking? Not what questions do the researchers want to ask? What questions do the communities need answers to? What questions do, you know, some of those frontline, the people facing frontline challenges, whether they're coastal communities or ocean industries or recreational ocean users, where are they facing the biggest challenges? And then what kind of data do we need? Because we don't need everything. What kind of information do we need to be able to provide the researchers data in order to predict how we might move going forward?
Yeah, Charlotte, so that sounds like a challenge in the predictive capabilities and observations that we may not yet have, but also in our way of approaching how we prioritize which observations and predictive capabilities we even develop to begin with, right? So it's really a new way of thinking as well as increasing and enhancing our ability to predict the future. Yeah. Dr. Halpin, would you like to weigh in on that, or?
Yeah, just to
Yeah,
augment
please.
that, from the more science perspective, research perspective, one of the things that always comes up, and it's actually makes it more challenging on the investment side, is we often have to make the case as scientists that we need to study the things that may not look important. And because there's often a bias to getting observations where we see something. So someone sees a rare habitat, a rare species, or an event, and we study that. But we don't have comparable data, and we don't have structured research design plans that allow us to actually create inference to answer questions and to be able to say, is that the most important site, or is that site worthy of protecting? And this is more challenging because it's hard to make that investment case for, like, no, we need to study places that may not be the things that are attractive. And as a scientist, it's a challenge. And I could go on, but there's many, many ways we could do that more efficiently. But it takes an extra level of interest in the scientific design to be able to push that forward. And because it's politically more challenging. It's easier to say, let's look at the things that we know are obvious. And it's harder to say we need to invest in looking at things that may not be as obvious. I'll pass it along. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Armin, you've raised your hand. You want to jump in?
I appreciate that, Nicole. I'll keep it brief because I completely agreed with everything Charlotte and Pat has already said about identifying the gaps and then also needing to invest in things that aren't being invested in currently around, research and data on ocean observations. But the other thing that I wanted to include here was, yes, I can state that we definitely need the U.S. to, it's leading in terms of ocean observation, but it still can do more. Like money is always something that is spoken about here in this space, funding, but there's always room for more. And we as folks that are, residents of the US that are able to call on to their congressional, their Congress members, their representatives, et cetera, to ask for more funding in these areas is crucial. But the real thing that I wanted to mention here, for at least for these questions, was that we also need to make sure that there's data sharing with communities that most need it. Frontline communities being them, also small island nations, right? Because we also know that we need to not only be looking at developing more ocean observations of some of the deeper parts of the ocean, but just remote islands as well. And so, these communities are often the first to experience these impacts of climate change, as folks know in the room. But this is despite the fact that they contribute least to.
Uh-oh, it looks like Armin froze. All right. Well, I think we understand his point. I just actually returned from the fourth convening of the United Nations of the Small Island Developing States. And this is an ocean climate connection is an urgent matter for them. And, absolutely, they want data sharing and they don't want to reinvent the wheel. They don't have the time for that. All right, let's move on to the next question. Hopefully Armin can reconnect with us. So all of you have international experience. What do you think that other nations and their advancement in ocean climate science have could we learn from them? What are you seeing in your field that the United States could learn from? Sue, would you be able to kick us off on that one?
Well, sure. Let me pick up on the topic of sea level rise. And we were also involved in the conference that you just mentioned. And we're, very conscious of the kind of pressures and challenges that are facing small island states, low-lying nations. And so it's one of our top priorities is dealing with the sea level rise challenge. So maybe I'll mention a couple ways in which we are, I guess, learning from them what their challenges are and trying to respond effectively. Obviously, the most important thing you can do, or the most foundational thing we could do, is try to reduce global emissions. And of course, that's been, top of mind since the beginning of this administration, rejoining the Paris Agreement, pushing the major economies to reduce their emissions. This year, we're very focused on the next set of Paris Agreement targets, the so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. They're due next February. So we are trying to make sure that obviously the countries that are most critical for keeping 1.5 degrees within reach are taking ambitious action. But the second thing we need to do is work on, enhancing global resilience to climate impact, so-called, adaptation or resilience, including sea level rise. And there we have the president's initiative called Prepare. Speaking of things that require money, that's obviously one of them. As I mentioned, we're working on our contribution to the Secretary General of the UN Early Warning for All initiative. The idea is to get everyone in the world, give them access to early warning within the next, 5 years from about a year ago. We've been working with the Pacific Islands in particular on the setting up of the Pacific Resilience Facility. And various US agencies, including your own and NASA, have been contributing in the sense of helping to monitor and predict sea level rise with respect to various Pacific islands. The third thing we've done beyond, mitigation and adaptation kind of broadly is to articulate policy that we think has been kind of warmly received by small islands, low-lying nations. And that's basically, a concern that's been raised by not only Pacific Islands, but islands in general, is like what happens when there's sea level rise to their maritime zones? What happens, eventually if their territory disappears to their very existence and, their statehood? So President Biden announced over the last couple of years two things, basically that states should not, as a policy matter, lose their maritime zones or their statehood as a result of human-induced climate change. So I think we're trying to address the issue in terms of money, technical assistance, and policy announcements. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, the issue of what happens to statehood is really going to be at the forefront of our international conversations. Okay. I am not sure if we have Armin back. I think we might. I sure hope we do, because this next question is right up his alley. But we'll go to maybe others for the moment and see if we can get him back. This is a question that I find to be good for this panel because I think we're kind of intergenerational on this panel. And I'm asking what the panelists, oh, there's Armin. Hi, welcome back, Armin. So Armin, here's our last question. What advice do you have for early career professionals and students and young leaders, and how can they get involved and make a difference when it comes to ocean and science and climate, and how are we better really preparing the next generation of ocean and climate leaders? Armin, do you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And my apologies, folks. I had to switch over to my cell phone. We've got some storms down here and our power went out, took out the Wi-Fi with it. But nonetheless, we're back on the horse. Well, for your question, Nicole, I appreciate it. I think that whether it's young leaders or early career professionals, myself included in both of these categories, my goodness, my experience has been to really seek out, and my advice would be to offer, based on experiences, to seek out interdisciplinary experiences and actively engage in networking as opportunities as much as possible. It has been, I can't stress enough how the work that we're doing in the Gulf South with frontline communities like mine, and not only in the U.S. Gulf South, but as well as Mexico and Cuba as well, it has only been doable because of relying on the resources of our network. So if you're able to and have that capacity, definitely engage in networking opportunities. Participate in conferences and workshops, things that seem a little bit mundane or there's a lot of workshops that NOAA has to offer, and there's a lot of them, but some of them are really, really great, and you have opportunities to meet some wonderful folks. Many organizations are doing some of these things as well. I can't stress enough how essential it is also to learn about cultural competency in this work and how to approach your work through an empathetic and DEI lenses. In the state of Texas, I got to be careful when using that, but we know it's still vitally important in this kind of space around environmental justice. Understanding that cultural contexts and challenges faced by different communities, if you can understand those, it opens the door for more effective and inclusive advocacy and engagement, 110%. We also know that based on real empathetic leadership through Heirs to Our Oceans and the U.S. Youth Advisory Council by implementation, it helps build genuine connections and trust. And that is probably the most important thing, building trust when working with frontline communities as well. The last thing I'll leave you with is a quote from a hometown hero, but also a wonderful labor rights activist, Cesar Chavez, who once said, this was something that we recently shared with our youth leaders from the Gulf of Mexico, that the fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people. And so take some time. I hope that you can reflect on this and remember that this work always ties back to people and our planet as well. Thanks so much, Nicole.
Thank you, Armand. What wise words those were. Thank you so much. Sue, please.
Well, I agree with Armin definitely on the importance of interdisciplinary study, but I thought I'd mention one more thing that in my work has been, I think, really important, and I would recommend for those who are training or already sort of young scientists, is to learn how to translate complicated science into language that can be understood by kind of non-specialist policymakers. This comes up a lot in the reports of the IPCC. If you read a report of the IPCC, they're quite impenetrable, very long, very convoluted, they're constantly kind of punctuated with, high confidence, low confidence. Somebody has to take that information and actually turn it into something that others can understand and help make policy decisions kind of on the basis of. And I think that's a unique skill among scientists, many of whom are not comfortable kind of dumbing down the complicated things that they deal with. But I think it's very important if you're actually going to have an impact on policy making. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sue. Charlotte, what advice would you give to young professionals and leaders?
Sure. I think if there's one thing, and I think, Sue and Armin picked up or mentioned this previously, it's that don't think that you don't have a space to contribute to the questions that need answers. I think at least when I started my career, and some of you are around for that, it was very much, I very much looked to the leaders in the field and thought they had all the answers, and again, not suggesting the leaders in the field don't have much teaching and learning to give. But I will say that, I think as we've been discussing here, I think how we think about science and oceans and climate and research is now a little bit flipped on its head. It doesn't just start with who has the smartest research question to ask. It really starts with, where do we see the problems? Where do we see questions that need answers? And I think anybody, you don't have to have worked in a university setting with 4 PhDs and 3 master's degrees to be able to see that. Individuals may not have individuals may have worked on the water, through 5 generations, and they are the ones best positioned to say, you know what, these are the questions, or here are the threats we're really facing that we need help with. So I think don't underestimate, no matter where you are in your career, your ability to help identify where the challenges are and how to engage in asking the questions.
Thank you, Charlotte. All right, Pat, professor.
Yeah. So in my other day job, I run a master's program on coastal and marine systems. And just really to build on everything Charlotte and others said, I really think it's so important to focus on applied science analysis, what you can bring to the table to inform decision making, be practical. Think about the problems. What are the solutions that need to be addressed? Don't just think that if I study this field forever, I'm going to know what the answers are. You have to think about solving problems one block at a time. You heard being interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. We very much stress that, but you can't be a jack of all trades and master of none. You have to be a master of some. And so it's really, really important to pick the things that you can really contribute to, and then know how to build a team that can help fill in the gaps. Another thing, being a gray-haired person on this, I think we need to promote more intentional progression and across generations. And this is something, just as a personal example, Christina Gerdet and I have been co-chairing the High Sea Specialist Group for years and years and years. And last year, we actually handed the baton over to 3 young professionals to co-chair the committee, and we've kind of stepped back. And we're trying to do that to bring in the next generation and do that in a constructive way where we can keep the senior advisors on and actively engage, but let the next generation actually take charge and run the show. And I think this is something we really need to do more actively. I could go on and on, but I think that's enough right now.
Well, thank you so much. This interdisciplinary but also intergenerational panel was purposeful. For folks longer in the tooth than I, their research questions were very different than the ones that I faced, than the ones that the young professionals are facing today. And I think we all know enough about climate change and the impacts in the ocean to know that the rate of change is rapid and it's accelerating. And so it is on us to bring into effective decision-making and leadership the next generation as quickly as we can, with as much competence as we can, because I know I've spent my career wanting to do things that will last, positive impacts that will be durable and that will last for generations. And here I am asking myself, as I do those things, am I consulting with those who will implement those decisions? If I am successful and they will last for generations, then am I really bringing shoulder to shoulder with me those who will feel the impacts of my decision making? And that's really been eye-opening for me, and I appreciate everyone's perspectives today. We have had such a good conversation. I appreciate the panelists and their expertise, their varied and diverse expertise. Armin, Charlotte, Pat, and Sue, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of CHOW. Enjoy the rest of your day. Armin, I hope those storms pass. Stay in touch and keep up the good work. Thank you, everyone.